In terms of Zoom etiquette, please remember to remain on mute unless you are asked to unmute during the Q&A. Use the chat function to leave comments. I'll be monitoring the chat and it will be saved. Use the Q&A function to pose questions for the moderated panel discussion. During the Q&A, we ask that everyone be respectful and mindful of airtime so that we may be inclusive of many voices and perspectives. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants. It will also be housed on the FSNE Campaign for Climate Resilience webpage, along with the slide deck. FSNE and NESN would like to acknowledge the support of the French Ministry and the 4 per 1,000 initiative for their generous contribution to this event. This webinar builds on FSNE's co-sponsorship of the 3rd Symposium of the Northeast Healthy Soil Network, held at the University of New Hampshire in March of 2023. The symposium revealed a gap in the regional discourse focused on climate resilience that could be filled by FSNE. This led to the launch of the FSNE narrative campaign for climate resilience and spurred ongoing collaboration with NESN that helped us identify this topic and plan for today's webinar. For those of you who are new to our network, I'll share just a bit about Food Solutions New England. FSNE is a multiracial regional network launched in 2011 and coordinated by the Sustainability Institute at the University of New Hampshire. FSNE works on 4 key impact areas through our lens of shared values of democratic empowerment, racial equity and dignity for all, trust, and sustainability. FSNE has come together with wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities to create a regional policy initiative called the New England Integrated Policy Program. FSNE and Wildlands and Woodlands networks hold complementary visions and goals and a clear understanding that these visions cannot be realized in isolation. Together, we represent a broad network of advocates, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and we work to advance land and water conservation and support the just transition of food, land, forestry, and fisheries systems. We recognize that it's only in reshaping the collective conception of how resources are allocated that there will be a new era of equitable stewardship and resilient communities. At FSNE, we believe that explicitly justice-oriented and anti-racist approaches are essential to generate equity and are thus essential to all of our work. Key to this is for all of us to better understand and attend to the grief and trauma that has been inflicted on Black, Indigenous, and other people and communities of color and persists to this day. FSNE commits to working in relationships to define new narratives that fail to reproduce harm as we work to dismantle the root causes of systemic oppression. As we enter into today's discussion focused on assessing the impacts of USDA programs on climate resilience and farm viability in New England, and advocate for farmers to have access to the tools and resources needed for truly sustainable and equitable solutions, we take a moment to recognize the power of dialogue to connect us across difference, that stretching across difference is essential for building community, and that tension can be transformative as new understandings emerge. Today, we hold space for broad dialogue and discussion, which we attend to with empathy, respect, and accountability. I'll now pass it over to our panel moderator, Julie Davidson, Farm Finance Specialist at the Soil Carbon Initiative and core member of NESN.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here today and among all the panelists. Thank you for everybody for attending. I just want to share a little bit about my work. In addition to my volunteer work with the NESN, the Northeast Healthy Soil Network, I'm also board president of NOFA New Hampshire, and I work as the farm finance specialist with the Soil Carbon Initiative. It's a program of Green America. The Soil Carbon Initiative is an ecosystem of programs that advances continuous improvement toward soil health and farm regeneration. The Soil Carbon Initiative's outcome-based third-party verification program is designed to support farmers from all production systems and companies to make and meet regenerative management commitments while building trust and transparency in the supply chain. And so in my role, I work with farmers in all types of production systems of all sizes, conventional to organic, to find funding for their soil health and market development. If you could go to the next slide, Karen. Thank you. So today is the start of a conversation being hosted by FSNE to lift up policy solutions that support equity and justice in our food systems. Our goal for this webinar is to examine, through the lens of a just transition framework by movement generation, the USDA funds directed toward climate and conservation initiatives and directives from the Glowing Climate Solution Act. So the USDA has invested record level of investments that have been championed as a climate win by NGOs, Democrats, and the regenerative movement at large. Some of these motives include reducing the steep rise in insurance claims. As you'll see on this slide, in 2002, we've seen insurance claims rise from 3 billion to 19 billion in 2023. De-risking corporate investment, transitioning commodity corporate supply chains, and reducing barriers for entry into carbon markets and greenhouse gas emission programs, addressing historic racism in USDA programs by prioritizing and reducing matching requirements for underserved populations. But do these initiatives go far enough, especially after centuries of limiting capital or access to capital to generate wealth? By comparison, there is a much smaller amount being invested into regional food system and small holding farms that often have better biodiversity outcomes and resiliency in cases of supply chain disruptions, as we saw during the pandemic. And these are some of the programs that I find both small and transitioning farmers across the country, as well as local farmers here in New England accessing and finding the most benefit from. Through the Growing Climate Solutions Act, the USDA has taken heavy emphasis on data for greenhouse gas modeling and encouraging collaboration throughout the USDA department. And researchers have provided a cautionary tale through work that has shown a bias in big data and opaque and artificial intelligence that has reproduced racism, classism, and many forms of inequity. So our panelists today will be talking about some of the work and initiatives they are doing to overcome that. The Growing Climate Solution Act is described by proponents as uniquely positioned to assist farmers with making decisions about engaging in carbon markets and provide resources to farmers by calling for establishment of user-facing databases with information on carbon markets. Their directive from the Act include creating the USDA General Assessment of the Role of Agriculture and Forest in U.S. Carbon Markets. That report was released in October of 2023 with recommendations on how to align and use USDA funding to support this. Establishment of a federal advisory committee that would recommend protocol standards, methods, and qualifications. And the USDA would also provide a list of technical service providers and third-party barriers, as well as a list of widely accepted protocols. So there's a link in relationship to all of these funding sources as we're seeing. Can we move to the next slide, please? As far as carbon markets are concerned, I won't go into what they are and how they operate. There's a lot of information on that, including recently published series webinars by NOFA New Hampshire. American Farmland Trust has just released a guide to carbon markets for farmers. So there's lots of information out there. But in general, what we're finding on the ground is that they're not meeting farmer expectations. There are low adoption rates globally. Carbon markets have been in process for a long time, and they frequently lead to land grabbing and human rights abuses, primarily in the global south, although they're quickly moving here up north in New Hampshire. We have a very large carbon market in the North Country, which has limited access to foresters. That was their source of livelihood and income. We see land being put into trust, and carbon markets are being sold locally here as well. So there's a lot of future implementation in these markets. It has been described as the Wild West. And farmers who have engaged in these carbon markets are often finding that because the carbon sequestration isn't meeting target goals, they're receiving less payments, often lot of transition costs are also taken out of their final payment. So there's a number of issues that need to be worked out, and that is what a lot of these programs are set to achieve, but how they land in terms of justice, equity, and reinforcing the current paradigm shift is to be debated, and part of what we'll be discussing here today. All right, if we could go to the next slide, please. So here's an interesting map that just shows the IRA funds, states where farmers will receive less federal funding if Congress diverts IRA climate smart conservation funds. Ironically, it is in a lot of Republican states. And so, Karen, if you can click on the link above the IRA funds at risk. So here we see a map, and you'll get access to these PowerPoints so you can link to this helpful map. And if you click on, let's click on Vermont, Karen, you can see the amount of conservation funds that are predicted to, go into the state and what potentially could be at risk. And the debate right now is taking these funds and moving it towards crop subsidies. So as opposed to conservation funding. Another issue that Senator Booker and his colleagues have taken opposition to is the NRCS recent decision to make certain practice eligible for conservation practice funding through IRA, particularly things like manure digesters that would eat up a lot of funds that would be available to farmers that are implementing actual conservation practices on the ground. So let's see. And then if we can go to the next slide, please. The climate smart commodities. The climate smart commodities grants, here's a profile of funding that has hit New England. And so the valuation pathways and how they work with the climate smart commodities grants is the farm will undertake an eligible climate smart ag farm practice based on the type of project that they are a part of. They produce a commodity and greenhouse gas benefit. The farm couples the commodity and greenhouse gas benefit into a climate smart commodity that is purchased by a processor and registered with a greenhouse gas registry. And so we see there are climate smart consumer products being available, also fuels, low carbon fuels, and the climate friendly export market or as a result of these. And it also assists the government in meeting some of their climate smart targets. If we can go to the next slide, please. What we're proposing today in our discussion and through presentation by the panelists is that we use this framework to provide anyway, I guess what I want to say is this framework provides a vision of transition from a consumerism and colonial mindset worldview whose purpose is the enclosure of wealth and power to a worldview of caring and sacredness whose purpose is ecological and social well-being. The values filter is key transition and where we hope to seek common ground. And so for today's discussion, we want to, analyze these funds and programs through this transition lens, where we reinforcing the existing scaffolding that reinforces the current paradigm and not truly transitioning the financial sector along with the regenerative ag practices that are happening on the ground. And where investments in corporate supply chains and technology platforms that generate profits for the few and not many will create markets, but do nothing to break farmers, excuse me, out of the current economic situation where they only receive pennies on the dollar for their labor and land stewardship. We simply cannot expect farmers to bear the cost of the transition alone, and they should not have to go into debt to get out of production systems that were encouraged and reinforced by these models and paradigms. So what I'd like to leave us with a question and thought is, policy development is usually crafted to solve a problem rather than achieve a vision. And so what is the vision we hope to achieve, and whose voices are we including, and more importantly, not including as we create this vision as it relates to funding? And so with that, I would like to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Julie Snorek, with the USDA fellow, who's going to be talking with us about the USDA research and some of the questions they're asking. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for being here today. As Julie mentioned, I'm Dr. Julie Snorek. I'm delighted to address this audience in my new capacity as a fellow for the American Association of Advancement of Science. And I'm serving at the USDA in the Office of the Chief Scientist in Washington. And I think one of the biggest changes for me is that I actually have to follow my notes as opposed to when I was at Dartmouth when I could kind of wander. So forgive me for that. Also, I wanted to issue a heartfelt welcome or thank you to Karen Nordstrom and Julie Davidson for their instrumental work in bringing us together here today. So thank you both for that. My role at the USDA and at the Office of the Chief Scientist, our office essentially helps deliver science and research that underpins the department's policies, practices, and programs. We're catalyzing and coordinating knowledge that's being developed in agricultural research centers in the US and around the world. My goal for you today is to be able to walk away from this presentation with a deeper understanding and appreciation of the USDA's science and research. Can we go to the next slide? So to understand how the Office of the Chief Scientist helps to steer and guide the science and innovation that powers our department, let's first look at the structure of how we operate. As you can see in the slide, the USDA is massive. We're made up of 29 agencies and offices with nearly 100,000 employees who serve the American people at more than 4,500 locations around the world. Under Secretary Vilsack's leadership in the Biden-Harris administration, we're all doing the critical work of supporting our farmers, improving the health, nutrition, and quality of life of all Americans, and protecting our land, forest, and clean water. Our office lies within the research, education, and economics mission area of the USDA. Next slide. So the RE-mission is essentially the USDA's largest component by size, consisting of the Office of the Chief Scientist and 4 departments, science and research agencies. In total, the RE-mission area has more than 8,500 dedicated employees. And our team includes world-renowned scientists, researchers, economists, statisticians, and many others, all working to solve the world's most complex challenges. Next slide. Leading our office is the USDA's Chief Scientist and Undersecretary, Dr. Chavanda Jacobs-Young. Dr. Jacobs-Young advises the Secretary of Agriculture and other senior officials on scientific matters. She leads RE along with Dr. Deirdre Chester and Dr. Richard Dirksen, and together we serve as USDA's core scientific enterprise, ensuring our scientific portfolio is coordinated, communicated, and held to the highest standards across the department. This work is two-pronged in that we serve and coordinate the scientific communities working on agricultural research and appropriately share this work with policy and decision makers to inform government decisions, policies, and regulations. Next slide. On May 8th, 2023, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, and the USDA Chief Scientist, Dr. Chavanda Jacobs-Young, announced the public release of the USDA Science and Research Strategy 2023 to 2026, Cultivating Scientific Innovation. Using the QR code on the screen here, you can download the full strategy right now if you like. I'll also show that QR code later. The strategy is a bold 3-year vision to make agriculture more productive, profitable, and sustainable for all. It was developed with input from across the department and external stakeholders and partners. And its intention is to provide a North Star for agricultural science that will spur innovation and collaboration across the USDA and with our partners, stakeholders, and the communities we serve as we take on the world's greatest challenges together. Next slide. The foundation of USDA science are 5 principles, and these are interwoven into the science and research strategy. So they are equity, inclusion, sustainability and resiliency, bold transformational thinking, stakeholder partnerships, and scientific integrity. And these serve as a guide that underpins all the work that we do at the Office of the Chief Scientist. Next slide. Looking at equity a bit more, equitable access to science-based, data-driven information and new technologies underpins the USDA's mission and priorities in support of all American people. To drive the greatest impact, our research must be inclusive, equitable, accessible, innovative, and competitive. At the USDA, we apply an equity lens to everything we do in our research, programs, training, and outreach activities. By working with community members and leaders early and often, the USDA and our partners create solutions that are designed with real people's lived experiences in mind, allowing us to have the greatest impact possible. And this is demonstrated through the co-development of research projects through our 10 regional climate hubs, including that in the Northeast, and through the National Institute for Agriculture's launching recently of an environmental justice initiative in 2023. Next slide. As you'll see as you read through the USDA science and research strategy, we've outlined 5 key science priorities that will help advance U.S. agriculture and address complex challenges. These are accelerating innovative technologies and practices, driving climate-smart solutions, bolstering nutrition, security, and health, cultivating resilient ecosystems, and translating research into action. The science and research strategies' cross-cutting priorities reflect the intersectional challenges and opportunities we face and outline how the USDA plans to meet this moment. This strategy is a call to action for you as well as our stakeholders and partners nationwide to join us in proposing big and audacious solutions that advance these priorities. So we need you. We need your vision, your ideas, your energy, your knowledge to bring this strategy and the next strategy to fruition. Next slide, please. So how will we achieve this? So public investments in agricultural research, development, and deployment have long been essential for America's prosperity and resilience. And public R&D investments are not just good for agriculture, but also beneficial to the economy. On average, every $1 that's invested in public agricultural R&D equates to about $20 that are added to the economy. So research, data, technology can create new opportunities throughout agriculture and forestry systems to support our nation's farmers, ranchers, and producers, as well as our urban and rural communities. The Northeast area of the Agricultural Research Service encompasses 15 research centers and laboratories and 9 work sites located in 11 Northeastern and Atlantic states from Maine to Tennessee and the District of Columbia. The mission area of ARS in the Northeast conducts innovative, fundamental, and applied scientific research to develop and transfer solutions that address agricultural and human health problems of national priority. The National Institute for Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, provides leadership and funding for programs that advance agricultural-related sciences. And in the Northeast alone, USDA has invested more than $62 million in the past 5 years towards soil health-related NIFA grants. You can see a sample of these here and the universities that are working on those projects. Next slide. So climate change is greatly impacting the Northeast's regional ability to produce food. Increasingly, cities and towns across the Northeast are developing or implementing plans for adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. These approaches are designed to maintain and enhance the everyday life of residents and promote economic development. Also, furthering this are the climate hubs in the Northeast. They're developing and delivering science-based, regional-specific information and technologies with U.S. agencies and partners to agricultural and natural resource managers to enable climate-informed decision-making and provide access to assistance to implement those decisions. Climate hubs are partnering throughout the USDA with universities, with nonprofit organizations, state and private partners, as well as with tribes, federal, state, local organizations. And currently in the Northeast, they have 24 active projects that focus on various areas such as agriculture, forestry, weather, climate, agroforestry, climate education, and climate equity. Next slide, please. So implementing this strategy will require not only the work of the climate hubs, of NIFA grants, of ARS research centers, but also cooperation from all sectors, public and private. The USDA Science and Research Strategy serves as a call to action for all stakeholders and partners nationwide to propose innovative ideas, solutions, and discoveries around these 5 priority areas. Next slide, please. We warmly welcome your thoughts and feedback on this strategy. You may learn how to join the conversation and get involved by visiting our website or emailing us here today. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion. And I think, Julie, you're going to introduce the next speaker. All right.
Thank you very much, Julie. Julie has been a longtime member of the Northeast Healthy Soil Network as well. Our next speaker is Philip Ackerman Least. He is a Vermont farmer, and he will be here talking about it's Matt Sheffer from, my apologies, from Hudson Carbon, based out of New York and located at Churchtown Dairy. Matt?
Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here. Thank you all for your time and attention. Apologize if it feels like I'm racing through my segment here, but my aim is to capture some key points in a limited amount of time related to what we're up to at Hudson Carbon. So to ground the conversation in some specifics with the science and research strategy that Julie Snorik just discussed, wanted to zoom in on objective 2.1, which is about measurement, which is what we focus on, and want to specifically focus on soil carbon, a metric that gets a lot of attention these days, of course. I wanted to highlight the various factors that affect soil carbon flux, barriers for quantifying this change and associating it with management changes, and opportunities for advancing MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. So with or without active management, soil carbon is always in flux, but management can change the balance in one direction or the other. So bioregional context matters quite a bit, including local and regional variability of soils, topography, and so forth. But also how a farmer specifically implements practices such as cover cropping, tillage reduction, rotational grazing, and so forth is very significant. To quantify soil carbon change, we're still up against some significant barriers, mostly around the trade-off between cost and accuracy, which also bears on scalability, how we scale these efforts up. Next slide, please. And so to illustrate this, I'll focus on 2 different approaches, process-based modeling and then direct measurement and empirical modeling. In the absence of direct measurement, process-based modeling uses farm management data to make estimates or predictions of one or more metrics, including soil carbon, depending on the model. There are obvious advantages to this method, namely cost effectiveness and scalability, because site-specific data like soil carbon, which is costly to acquire, is not necessary for the model to run. However, the drawbacks are significant. First, these models are inherently deterministic, which means that they have a hard time accounting for the random variation we would expect in natural systems, and uncertainty is therefore difficult to quantify. Also, these models are meant for greater spatial and temporal scales, and therefore using them to predict changes in soil carbon at the level of fields or farms over shorter periods of time can lead to inaccurate predictions. Data sovereignty and governance concerns for farmers are also at play. Doran Cox, who's on the panel, will discuss a little bit about this, I think, because requirements to share management data for running this type of model are at play. And model training and validation. So data from a variety of systems and a variety of bioregions is important for the universal functionality of these models, and we still need a lot more validation data to get models working at the levels we need them to. Next slide, please. Some examples here of the kinds of models I'm referring to. Most familiar to the audience might be Comet, whose background model is actually called Descent. Other efforts are underway to improve models such as what Regrow is doing with the DNDC model. I think we have Bill Salas out here in the crowd, so shout out to Bill. It's important to recognize, though, that there are a variety of potential models to leverage, and using these tools in tandem in an ensemble, if you will, is a strategy to enhance their effectiveness. Next slide, please. On the other hand, direct measurement can provide much more certainty in estimates of soil carbon stocks and stock change, and the more samples, the better, because one of the key things to account for in sampling design is geospatial variability, which bears heavily on how carbon is distributed throughout a field. But the downside is obviously cost. Again, in-field sampling and lab processing and measurement of carbon are expensive. So reducing the sample density without diminishing our ability to account for spatial variability is, of course, the trick. So how do we do this? You can use data-driven approaches to account for variability through a stack of metrics that influence soil carbon change, like topographical features, soil type, vegetation indices from satellite-based sensors, and so forth, and run these through an algorithm that can set sample zones or sample points at cost-effective densities. But there are also scalar limitations to this approach, as spatial variability of soils, as farmers, particularly here in the Northeast, know quite well, can be very high at field or farm scale. But this variability inevitably plateaus when we get to a regional scale, so we can potentially manage sample density across a larger area, across a group of farms, for example, reducing costs for individual farms potentially. So while these methods have been showing promise in recent studies, more research is necessary to further answer key questions like sample density required to detect change, and associating that change with management practice change. Along with the USDA's science and research strategy, there's proposed federal legislation recognizing the need for more research, such as the Advancing Research in Agricultural and Climate Impacts Act, or ARACI, A-R-A-C-I is the acronym. But with what we know so far, there are opportunities for leveraging these approaches to support performance-based incentives for farmers, particularly focusing on regional initiatives to solve for this scale problem, and using a hybrid approach where direct measurement can serve as validation for model predictions, ultimately reducing cost while also reducing uncertainty. As you can see, there's an opportunity here for incorporating this knowledge into the implementation of the Growing Climate Solutions Act, for example, which Julie highlighted early on. Next slide, please. But of course, soil carbon is not the only metric we should care about. In ecology, everything is interconnected and interdependent. You can't do just one thing. Therefore, a holistic approach is critical to hedge against unintended negative consequences of incentive programs based on single metrics. So in that spirit, my colleague Philip Ackerman-Leist will now zoom us out of the soil carbon focus and take us through his work in developing a new, developing and extending a new holistic framework for ecological benefits. Thank you all, and take it away, Philip.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. And thanks to Karen and all the Julies in the world who have helped make this happen here today. So really appreciate this conversation. I think it's a critical one to be having as we're thinking forward. And I think Elizabeth Henderson in the chat here helped set me up a little bit as well. So one of the concerns that some of us have run into is exactly what Matt just said, is there's sometimes some tunnel vision with regard to carbon. And so the Lexicon has been, which is an NGO based in Petaluma. We do international work. I'm head of editorial there. I'm also a farmer here in Vermont, doing grass-fed livestock. But we've been very concerned about the tunnel vision that's there. And what we've been working on now for the past just over a year is this ecological benefits framework. So we feel like we need to be thinking about all of these interfaces in terms of the ecological systems, which humans are part of. So air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon are the 6 buckets that we feel like we can put all of these concerns into. So next slide, please, Julie. So this ecological benefits framework has been an effort now. Matt was involved, as have been others, almost 200 people from around the world who were involved together in a sprint, coming from government agencies, coming from conservation organizations, humanitarian organizations. All of us very concerned that we needed to find a way in which to create a more universal language, a way of speaking, a way of seeing, a way of thinking that would help us not talk over one another, but instead really begin to ensure that we were speaking much of the same language. And that's what we've been working on creating here. So this is an adaptive framework that can be adapted to virtually any scenario. So we'll click to the next, please. And you can find this online, but the foundation of this at the lexicon and the work that's been happening there are these lex icons. And these have been developed now. There are over 1,000 of these that have been developed. They were initially developed with Adobe and also about 40 different designers around the world who wanted to create this open source common language, visual language, as you see here, that's machine readable, that obviously is highly universal, can be utilized in a lot of different formats. I think different folks on this call are also utilizing these lexicons right now as we speak, and they provide us a way to think about things both from the quantitative perspective and the qualitative perspective. Because part of what's happening right now, and this has been mentioned, as Julie Snorik said, we need to be thinking about these 5 parameters that the USDA has put forward. Data has to be equitable. It needs to be science-based. It needs to be accessible. And frankly, it also needs to be digestible and understandable, by all parties involved. So that's what we've been working on, is providing that framework. And so the next slide, if you would, please, Julie. And so utilizing these lex icons, we've developed a methodology for digital fingerprints and profiles that help explain a project. As you can see here, part of what is explained for any given project, this could be a farm, it could be a conservation initiative in one particular region. And I'll tell you a little more about some of the projects that we're doing. But essentially, as you see here with point A, we have the lex icon, we have the terminology. Again, a lot of us are using different terms, but we can find common cause, common ground, common language there. Those are divided into attributes, practices, and outcomes. And then on these digital profiles, we also provide the context to explain them further. And finally, as you see at the bottom of the bar here, below Makoko Pamoja, below the EBF wheel, as we call it, there's a bar for data integrity, because data integrity is also a critical piece of this. And there are different ways to categorize that data integrity, but very often, especially if you have a grassroots organization, it's self-reported. And then we start to move forward all the way across the, really the chain here, the bar. We move all the way across to audits, and then also in some cases having things on blockchain for transparency and traceability. So what we're trying to do here is to create a really unique and also highly visual and digestible system for helping people understand projects and impacts, and really understand the outcomes that this climate smart agriculture work should be aiming for. So then the next slide, please. And then we're also transforming this into different simulators. And this is one that we've developed for the World Food Program in Chad. And this is an effort to really be able to portray these different kinds of projects and initiatives, again, in a friendly way, in an interactive way, in a way that helps people that might be very much outside of these circles, the kinds of conversations we're having today, help them start to engage, interact, learn, digest, and then ultimately to be part of the solution as they understand the impacts in the science. So that really is what we're trying to do. Place-based is absolutely critical, whether it's the farm, the ranch, the conservation project, even the region. we're very interested at the lexicon with the ecological benefits framework of providing this tool, so that it can be utilized much more broadly. And it's being used by we're doing this project with the World Food Program, also with the Asian Development Bank. There are different investing companies who are looking at it. What we want to make sure that we really provide is this transparency and traceability. So, data is not all created equally, and we need to help bring that to the front and to the fore. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Philip. Our next speaker is Dorn Cox with Open Team.
Great, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to actually follow the last two speakers, which I feel frame up a lot of what Open Team is about. And so pleased to be in this panel to bridge the complexities and all of this topic, but also the substantial work and progress that we've been able to make over the last several decades to address some of these intractable, challenging projects of making those the parts of nature that have been invisible visible and then valuable, and incorporating that into what I believe is sort of completing our understanding of what agriculture is, which is not just the production of food, fiber, and energy, but also the rest of what we're asking from agriculture now, which we have always asked, but are really starting to understand the limits if we don't actually recognize that, which is the role in rural development and equity, and the role of climate mitigation, biodiversity support, and weather resilience, mitigating wildfires and floods and droughts. All of those things have value. And what we're recognizing is a lot of that isn't represented in the commodity value. And if we're going to be describing that and exchanging it in value, we have to have a language to describe that. And a lot of what the previous two speakers were talking about is creating that language, and the data-driven language that's both digestible and understandable. And then recognizing, and this is where Open Team comes in, is that this endeavor is multi-generational. It's a systems science, and it's a shared human endeavor. It's something globally that we're in the process of. So Open Team was really formed with that idea that in order to create our systems that support agriculture have not been built with that in mind. But we have examples of that, of large-scale collaboration in deep space exploration and in other large collaborative projects like the creation of the internet itself. So the acronym, just quickly, is Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management. And open in that as a shared human endeavor, and the scale at which we're working, it needs to be trusted. It needs to be accessible and equitable access to this critical information. Ecosystem, because it isn't about the technology or technology ecosystem, but actually the people in the communities that come together to make that possible. And again, a lot of the tools and technologies that we're using were developed within the context of a government department, or within the context of a corporation or a private enterprise. And so the technology ecosystem is, how do we actually build bridges so that we recognize that the part that we're working on is part of something larger that's necessary to affect agricultural management. The final piece is really important, because unlike every other shared science, agriculture, this knowledge, in order to be useful, has to be applied. And it's not about just understanding from a scientific perspective. It has to be understandable by the general public, but also those practitioners, the land stewards who are actually using and incorporating the best possible knowledge to be able to improve their livelihoods, and also the public benefit that they're creating and valuing. So that's sort of framing up the why. If you go to the next slide, we're also a collective impact organization of more than 70 organizations representing government agencies and private companies and food systems actors and ag tech organizations and producer organizations, primarily in North America, but also globally. I'll just briefly mention that we're in the process. This is not sort of official open team language at this point, but one of the things that I'm really inspired about and want to bring to this group is really thinking about our work in the context of other efforts like this, that we're really unified under a bigger idea, which is a new charter for agricultural knowledge commonwealth. How do we jointly describe the agricultural knowledge that we have and then put that into practice? And so that was the topic of the book that recently came out, called The Great Regeneration. But it also illustrates a big tension that I want to highlight with the other speakers and hopefully pick up in questions and dialogue later, which is we're balancing two really important things here as we're looking at ubiquitous access to knowledge, is that just as what was said, we want that to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's sort of the FAIR framework. That's critical building blocks to be able to build that common knowledge and use it. And as Matt mentioned, we have an equity, we have a sovereignty issue with that as well, is that we're also, as much as we're sharing knowledge, we also have the importance of stewarding and managing and creating sovereignty in our own landscapes, in our own communities. And so, and as we're trading on the data, our identities and what we've done, there's the risk of consolidation of power in that as well. And especially when we're talking about environmental claims, the same consolidation and enclosure processes that have happened we're at risk as well. So the FAIR principles, which were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, sort of counteract, and they go together. So this ubiquitous access to knowledge, but recognizing data sovereignty and the ability to create data cooperatives within that are recognizing the collective benefit, the authority to control our own destiny and the data about us and how that's used and how claims are processed, and the responsibility and ethics associated with all of that. So that's, again, a big, some big picture things I hope we can come back to. The rest of the slides, here, the rest of my comments here get into how we're actually implementing some of those principles. So if we go to the next, and I'll sort of reference here some very practical applications as Open Team works under our collaborations through the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, but also a lot with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, not only under the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, but also working with cooperative agreements across some of these new initiatives to bring incentives in the form other than commodity payments or direct payments for conservation practices. And so we're and under that, our focus even within that is really understanding what is the underlying data infrastructure that's necessary to create collaboration and large connections and equity across and sort of network visibility while we're preserving data sovereignty. And so that's so some of this comes in directly under the new investments in IRA greenhouse gas efforts that are focused on the data infrastructure to improve the data quality that Matt was talking about and improve the models and then generate better estimates that can then be part of that commonwealth of knowledge. The flower-like diagram on the right is sort of a representation of all of the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodity efforts. And I think partnership in the announcement was very important, and the linkages between those, both geographically and by subject matter and so forth. So there is a growing ecosystem that is being connected, and that's part of our role, is to sort of make those connections stronger and exchanges and create that that context of sort of dynamic mapping, but voluntary mapping with control of how we show up in a map like this. Next slide. And that's over 140 projects with thousands of partners that are now connecting. So the building blocks, looking at the foundation of how we're approaching this challenge of the individual data sovereignty and the this shared benefit and public good creation is really that the foundation of this starts at the landowner level. And that all of this really needs to come from the quality of the data collected has value at the management level in creating better plans and transforming at better outcomes for the land steward themselves, and the collection of that data and making a claim that's effective. And that high quality data at the farm level is what research, that's where our efforts with the research lies. So we're really creating a system where we say we should be able to enter data once and use it many times. And as that data is used for other purposes, that value accrues to the landowner. Or not, I shouldn't say landowner, sorry, land steward, because often it's the benefit isn't being created by the landowner, but those who are stewarding the land. And so that's really important from this, what we're calling a wallet concept. And this enter data once means that it's referenceable and it can be built into not only research and development, but that same confidence can flow up into things like certifications and government programs, and then ultimately into claims that we're seeing with things like schemes with a partnership for climate smart commodities or private markets, et cetera. So, but it's all the same. And the key there is that it's referenceable and that the benefit resides with those who create the value. So next slide. So this is just another illustration of that same concept, is that data sovereignty is actually the foundation of balancing individual enterprises and the benefit to the land stewards in creating a shared public science that's the foundation of better research, incentives and marketplaces. And so that flows directly into some of the things that you just saw in terms of, and you'll notice the iconography that we're using here is sort of how we're building on some of these other open source efforts. And you'll see represented here some of the exact kinds of things that Matt was talking about in terms of the direct measurement, remote sensing, agroecosystem models, all have their root in how do we exchange and create incentives for sharing this data that's a mix between environmental data and the activity data, the practices that the land stewards are actually doing. So we think that's really important, that there's full control and that it's easy to share. So those are again, there's a real tension here, but this is also achievable. So ease of data sharing, and that we create a collaborative environment to create a shared registry, like a registry of deeds of the world that we're mapping together. And just a side note, this is very similar if you go back to the origins of FAO in the 50s, post-colonial efforts to map the global soils and provide that information for land distribution and appropriate and matching appropriate agricultural knowledge globally. And yet we have far, far better tools to actually do this. So next slide. And I'm just about close to wrapping up here. So the core here from our perspective is that the technology is not enough. That really, as we said, as an ecosystem, it really is about trust in balancing the public benefit and the private goods, and the ability to create collaboration around that. And so that's the alignment of business models, social contracts, and legal and technical requirements, which requires that interoperability that we see in FAIR is about the alignment of all of those. If we don't have our legal agreements aligned, then the technology can't bridge it. And if we don't have trust from a social perspective, none of it does any good. So a lot of our effort in the last year has actually been to start to build some of the social contracts and expectations to build trust between technical service providers in the field working with land stewards and that are readable, human readable. And I'll just again shout out to the iconography work has been really important to build on in making some of these inaccessible, what might be not human readable or usable concepts usable. And so we've been focusing particularly on these social contracts, oaths of care for data service providers, and an agricultural bill of data rights. that can be referenceable by actors in this space to build on better trusted contracts that will allow for sharing and transactions and what we're calling conditional data use agreements. You can use this, but for a particular purpose that will protect the data and food sovereignty of the communities that are providing that information. So finally, this is again in practice. We are final slide. So we're in a structured process, creating this trust alliance, aligning the business, social, and technical requirements to actually implement this. Through our work with under Open Team and in the context of many collaborating with not just our own Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities efforts, but many others, more than a dozen, I think, at this point, but looking towards sort of something that can be ubiquitous. We are coordinating how are we collecting this data and protecting sovereignty. We are working through these models for processing and exchange, both inside the USDA and public and private entities exchanging across those boundaries, and how we share that data. And now really moving into an effort for how do we actually communicate about this vision and how we support improvement over time. So thank you so much for the time and really excited for the discussion.
Great, thanks, Dorn. We're moving next and shifting a bit to NRCS conservation funding and the great work that Jennifer Byrne is doing with the White River Conservation District. Thank you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to take a little bit of a shift in the focus here and really be talking about some democratic infrastructure that we have available to us and inviting all the listeners into this process. You're all a resident of a conservation district and you can really make an impact. Today, so my name's Jennifer Byrne. I'm a manager of a conservation district here in Vermont. We're a watershed-based conservation district, so we're basically like a watershed government. And the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun, and pretty much all this stuff is really the same story that we've been living, for the past 80 years and even further back. So I would just like to give a little bit of context and a little bit of history about why this locally led democratic infrastructure exists in the United States, where it comes from, and how it functions in the context of how agencies like USDA write their policies and make their funding decisions. So that being said, I'm gonna, these slides are a little bit dense at times because I wanted you all to be able to take these and look at them yourself and review them. So, bear with me, but let me go on. So probably everyone on this call is familiar with the Dust Bowl. And so during that time in the 30s, the USDA formed the Soil Erosion Service, which became the Soil Conservation Service, which became the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But way back, as early as 1935, the USDA managers began to search for ways to extend conservation assistance to more farmers. And they believed the solution was to establish democratically organized soil conservation districts to lead the conservation planning effort at the local level. Now, Hugh Hammond Bennett, who helped to form the NRCS, ran a study, an early study to evaluate the effectiveness of those first rounds of programs and demonstration projects. And they found, him and his team found that, too often these ideas were not being transferred onto private lands. There was a lack of direct involvement in the projects by local farmers. Farmers perceived these projects as too expensive, too time and labor intensive, too technical to implement themselves, and that this was just another government program being forced on them without their input. And then in 1936, what was devised by this team out of USDA was a standard state soil conservation district law. This was pretty this was a pretty big idea at the time, and this all still stands today. So at the time, they felt that they needed local government governed by local land occupiers and farmers to give input into the way that the USDA developed their programs, implemented their programs, and allow for local farmers to control decision making as the experts in their landscape and in their environment. They believe that all federal programs should be run through this new government entity, and that the SCS, now the NRCS, should only function through this newly formed conservation district rather than on its own, created and run by the people living within the boundaries of the district. And so anything in these slides that is underlined is a link, and I would really encourage people to explore this and click these links and find out how much history there is in and power there is in this infrastructure. So the original sample state law suggested a number of duties and powers that these conservation districts could take on, holding public elections for district supervisors. So our board of supervisors is a board of 5, and there's a democratic election every year for 1 seat on our district board. Surveying natural resources, purchasing land and equipment, distributing funding, carrying out conservation measures, and even promulgating land use rules. Currently in Vermont, we still have all of these rights. This little sign here, this function of the conservation district sign, it was basically the only thing left to me when I took this job 6 years ago. This was pinned on my desk. And so this was pretty much my onboarding package right here. The function of the district is to take available technical, financial, and educational resources, whatever their source, and focus or coordinate them so they meet the needs of the local land user for conservation of resources. Here's another resource for you all to just know about. So after this sample law was distributed across the country, since then, all 57 US states and territories have adopted a version of this law. There are over 3,000 conservation districts across the country, across all states and territories. And over the past 3 years, I have been leading a team to assemble all these statutes and code them in a database, which you could click the link and learn more about that. But if you're, no matter what state you're living in, you can find out more about how your election process is run, who's on the boards, and the powers of your district. So Julie in the beginning shared this just transition framework, and I am just posing here to you all that conservation districts can really be a driving factor of this shift in economic control to communities, distribution of democratic wealth in the workplace, advancing ecological restoration, driving racial justice and social equity, relocalizing production and consumption, and at the same time retaining and restoring local cultures and traditions. And one of the things I offer is that we reverse this arrow in the sense that there are ways to change the rules using locally led input, which I'm going to go through how to do that. But before I do, as if we needed any more reasons to focus on our democracy and equity and justice, I wanted to put up here 3 of the 17 principles of environmental justice that demand the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making, including needs assessments, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. Affirming the fundamental right of all people to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination, and affirming the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up and rebuild in balance with nature. Also, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act which states that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And what this means in effect, in order to show compliance with the civil rights law, all recipients of federal funds must create meaningful community engagement plans and language access plans. And I'm, putting this out here as a suggestion, especially to our partners who have received, this money for climate smart commodities, who aren't used to doing community engagement, that the locally led conservation process led by the conservation districts could be a key way to show compliance and build into your community engagement plans that are actually required to show compliance with civil rights law. And so here we go. This is the locally led conservation process as it's laid out in federal statute, rules, and guidance. These are two of the excerpts out of these programs manuals. NRCS has changed these links maybe twice just in the last year. So hopefully these links work when you click on them, but I highly encourage you to check out part 500 of the 440 programs manual and read it, and part 501. I would love to meet the people who wrote this someday, whoever you are. What this lays out is a process where each conservation district, meaning really each watershed, and not every conservation district is based on watershed. It was left up to the local residents to define the boundaries. But every conservation district is meant to chair their local working group. And the local working group is a subcommittee of your state's state technical committee. Every state has a state technical committee that provides information and analysis and recommendations to the USDA. The local working groups can directly influence statewide funding prioritization, ranking questions for applications. They can provide input on how conservation practice standards are written, and they can also provide information and recommendations on changing the payment rates of specific practices. Each local working group is supposed to represent the whole variety of crops and livestock raised within that local area, include forest land stewards, include any other professionals who work within the ag and natural resource space, and the local community more broadly. The conservation district is the default chair of the local working group, and if that district is not able or willing to serve as chair, the responsibility goes to the federal government to run this local process. So why I keep wanting to uplift this process is so that, the local people really see this as an opportunity to get involved and take control of their, and step into their power. There are many, many things topics you can engage in with your local working group as you create the plans, the action plans out of your group, including, education, programmatic recommendations, guidelines for developing new ranking criteria, like I said, and technical guidance on implementing conservation practices. This is all leading to this very exciting opportunity that exists now in 6 states across the country, and could exist in your state as well if it doesn't already. Local funding pools is a new opportunity where through your conservation district's local working group, a community, and that could be a county, it could be a town, it could be a small watershed, can request to have a local funding pool specific to meet their needs. So what this means is you're then not competing against the rest of the state in statewide funding pools. You're not competing against large farms and farms with really massive resource concerns, because a lot of what we see is just the way that ranking works and priorities are set. Farms with the most negative impact on the environment often are at the top of the list for getting funding. as an example, we've been running these local funding pools for the last 2 years. This will be our 3rd year. Our first year, we requested $30,000 for energy audits on farms, more as an experiment, because we knew that if a farmer comes into the office and asks for a energy audit, there really was no way that they would get ranked high enough to actually get that contract from NRCS. We were able to, sign up 6 farms, which totaled $30,000, and those contracts went through for our county. Then last year, we asked for $150,000 for community scale agriculture. We knew through our local working group and through our conservation action plan, what the community expressed to us was that they were most concerned about farm viability and food security. Those are 2 topic areas that really USDA doesn't pay for through NRCS. They're really more focused on natural resource concerns. And so we devised a local funding pool that listed about 20 practices that focused on small scale agriculture. And we, received a great deal of applications through our outreach. And we've spent now $150,000 as we're going through the ranking process right now, but there will certainly be spent that full amount in our community on high tunnels and raised beds and micro irrigation and hedgerow planting and soil health testing, just as an example. This year, we're doing outreach in as many towns as we can. We cover 23 towns, so we're really trying to do get a broad swath of input, and we're trying to make our local funding pool $1 million this year. You could think of this as a mini RCPP that's locally led by the priorities that are identified by the community. So you can see here, local funding pools are currently available in Hawaii, Minnesota, Montana, Oregon, South Dakota, and Vermont. No matter where you live, you can participate in your locally led, democratically organized soil conservation districts. So I really encourage everyone to find and connect with your local district, join your local working group, ask your district when it is, if they're holding it. If they're not, ask them why they're not. I guarantee you it's because they're not funded to do it. So then go ahead and ask your state to fund your conservation districts. Ask your districts about creating local funding pools. Go to your state technical committee and ask them to start up local funding pools. Absolutely run for your conservation district board of supervisors. We need people to get involved. The original intent was that this was to service land occupiers. Some states, 7 states, have changed that language to be landowner. A lot of states use the term resident. So, check your state law or check our database to find out who is eligible to run and who is eligible to vote. And I also encourage you to learn more. We're developing a conservation career workforce development program in partnership between Vermont and the Virgin Islands. And that's a really exciting opportunity. We're going to be training up a lot of conservation planners and TSPs to help get this money out the door. Because really right now with all the money that's coming down the pike, the majority of it is just going through the same channels as it's always been. So it's been difficult for us even to get the money out the door that exists. And now we have quintuple that amount of money to get out the door. So we really need certified planners. We need TSPs in the pipeline. So I really encourage you to click on this link and reach out about our workforce development program. And yeah, to learn more, tune in to our podcast called.
Thank you so much, Jen, for sharing that important work in ways that we can directly get involved and influence. That's really important. I don't think many people know about it. Our next panelist, I'm really thrilled to introduce, is Abby Course. Not only does she find time to run and manage her dairy farm, but she's also involved with policy on the national level and some really exciting research projects on our farm. So with that, Abby, I'll hand the mic over to you to respond and give some insights into what you're seeing and how all of what we've been talking today actually impacts farmers on the ground. So thank you, Abby, for joining us.
Thanks, Julie. I'm so thrilled to be here with everybody. I think I'll change, I'm going to change direction, I guess, again. As Julie said, so I've been a certified organic dairy farmer for 15 years. My professional career as a farmer has only been as an organic farmer. I mention that because I have found that to be fairly rare. And I'm in thinking about all these things and all of the USDA programs and how this impacts the farmers. It's really interesting. I didn't hear the people mentioned overly often in this presentation. And I keep coming back to a TED Talk that the Indigenous activist Lila June presents on keystone species and humans as a keystone species. Her definition of a keystone species is a species upon which the entire ecosystems depend. And she says, the earth may be better off without certain systems we have created, but we are not those systems. We don't have to be, at least. What if I told you that the earth needs us? What if I told you that we belong here? What if I told you that I've seen my people turn deserts into gardens? What if these human hands and minds could be such a great gift to the earth that they sparked new life wherever people and purpose met? Why try to control the earth when you can work with her? And I share that because that has been my entire orienting principle as a farmer, having entered into my professional life as a farmer, as an organic farmer, having come from a farm that was previously conventional, but also was operating as a small conventional traditional hill dairy in Vermont, where we haven't tilled ground in 40 years. We've been rotationally grazing our animals since the 1960s in a system that we have consistently updated and adapted to the point where we are now practicing intensive adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and training grazers here on our farm when we can find them, which is another one of my points, to try to put these practices into action for the purpose of climate resilience. And I think what I am consistently concerned about is we don't fund infrastructure, we don't fund labor. We often leave these changes, even if we're talking about a transition model, right? We always leave behind in the transition model discussion the early adopters of any practice. So for a farm like ours, and we've been a part of Organic Valley only as organic farmers, and so that's a farmer-owned, the largest farmer-owned organic farming cooperative in the country. And I bring that up because I'm seeing within Organic Valley and its structures the same limitations that a farmer like myself is coming up against in trying to access these programs as well. The ultimate reality of the United States is that until, in my opinion, we have a cheap food system, and even in spite of all of this programmatic work, these priorities, we're ultimately still not changing the paradigm that says that we want to ultimately produce the most food for the least amount of money. With, frankly, even, I love you, Julie, but the USDA priorities, I noticed it was interesting. The first one was based in technologies, right? I matter. My knowledge base matters. My relationship with the place that I steward matters. That is not being recognized in any of this work. And certainly there's so much there, right? I am a white woman. I am highly privileged. I'm about as privileged as you get as a farmer. We have so much work to do on the racial equity side of things. And I'm so excited by the initiatives and the way that the language has changed around that and things. But I still think that ultimately we're not shifting the paradigm. I'm not really sure how we're going to do that through the model of the USDA necessarily. I think that's a big ship to turn. And I think that these programs are critical in sort of the broader structures. But I think a lot of the work that Jennifer is talking about is equally critical so that on the ground, you are giving communities resources to be able to come together so that those ripples are moving out, because it has to be, I think, both. We're going to have to do some work from top down, as we're seeing with some of the shifts that the USDA is finally starting to try to make. You are hearing a lot more about the issues that are facing small and mid-sized farms, the ramifications of years of policy prioritization that essentially say that farms like mine don't belong in our food system. But we also are going to need that grassroots, bottom-up energy. And the reality is that the farmers that I am in contact with are exhausted. We have been depleted. We have been under-resourced. Those of us who have been trying to work with a strict intentionality towards not taking more from the environment than we give back have not been rewarded for years in the system that exists, even when you're functioning in the organic food system. Because as I said, when we're creating a cheap food system, even in the free market, which I personally think is nonsense, but even in the free market, a product like mine is still going to hit a price ceiling. And farmers like us, I think, struggle with the fact that our food is not accessible to the broad majority of the population. And so that's another component of this. And I just think, I guess that's what I would like to share is, please remember that I'm critical. You need, I'm 40 years old. You need myself and the generations under to find a viable pipeline and a viable career path into farming. And quite frankly, it doesn't exist. Not for the scale of farm that I come from. We run a 55 cow dairy herd. And I'm offering that again because some people would say, oh, well, you need to expand, you need to innovate, you need to do this, you need to do more. I always need to do more. What's going to happen when I need to do more, when I need to devote some of these grant processes? I'm neurodivergent, I have ADHD, I struggle immensely with applications. So a person like me, in order to get through something like that, I have to divert my time, energy, and attention away from that critical work of walking the land, of observing my place and putting into practice what Dorn referenced, right? These, and I think, Matt, you said this too, the practices are only so good as they are applied. And if the people who need to apply them are not resourced to do so in as diverse ways as those people are, that's where we're hitting blocks. If the systems are not as accessible as possible to the broadest swath of the population who's interested in farming, we're hitting barriers there. We're hitting a lot of barriers in terms of farmers being able to find time, energy, and effort to be able to apply for these programs. Thanks.
Yeah, Abby, thank you so much. And, to your point, we're not transitioning this system. And so I want to acknowledge, one, that we've run a bit out of time, but I think that's the work that we have ahead of us. And this will just be the start of the conversation, but please look at that transition framework. What do we have to do to move the needle? And another point I would like to mention is please put your questions in the chat. We do plan on following up in another forum as well as an issue brief. We apologize that we were not able to get to a question and answer point. And one thing I would like to just mention in closing on reflection before we pass it off to Andrew May, who's going to talk about some research and opportunity to continue these discussions, is a lot of the modeling and data collection and technology systems, do provide important data, but as Abby mentioned, it's not immediate feedback that is helping the farmers on the ground. A lot of these systems are helping to facilitate greenhouse gas emission quantification, facilitation into carbon markets. And then the bigger issue that is not often talked about with data is the ownership of data. And we know that the value is not an attribution, but it's in the aggregation of the data and who controls and who has issue. And I would point to the work of Katerina Pastor, her article Rule by Data, that advocates for data producers being compensated and the data aggregators they would have some compensation as well, but these big tech companies would be treated as agents, and they would be compensated for the harvesting and cleansing and processing of data, but not the data ownership as well. So with that, Karen, I'm going to send the mic back to you to introduce Andrew, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Julie. Just briefly, just to say, in response to what we've heard today, we wanted to provide an opportunity. So I want to point you toward the Aspires project that comes to us out of the Food Systems Research Center at UVM. I'd like to introduce you to Andrew May, who directs the project. He'll tell you how you can get involved in this project aimed at informing regional research priorities. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, and thank you to all the speakers as well. This has been a fantastic hour and a half. Really, really fantastic to see everyone speak. So, hi, my name is Andrew May. I'm a researcher with the University of Vermont in the Center for Sustainable Agriculture. And I'm here on behalf of the University of Vermont's new Food Systems Research Center. And it's just been getting going lately in the past year or so. They hired last year their new inaugural director, Polly Erickson. The Food Systems Research Center is a joint venture, the first joint venture with the USDA ARS Agricultural Research Service. Some of you may be familiar with their research and work. It's run by Christian Peters, who's the research lead of that office, and has a team and staff of people who are embedded and working alongside folks at UVM. And the Food Systems Research Center has a mission of developing solutions for improving human health, well-being, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability through food systems. So I would imagine that jives with quite a few of the people in this room. And to date, they've been working on a number of different topics and research projects surrounding small-sized farms, food enterprises, dairy systems, food security impacts from COVID, a variety of different things. But the project that I'm here to talk about and introduce today is the Aspires project, which stands for Alternative System Pathways for Interconnected Resilience, Equity, and Sustainability. So basically what this translates to is working in communities with community partners to further ideas around alternative food system futures. So what can we be doing that's going to make the food system in the Northeast more resilient, more equitable, and more sustainable? And to do that, we're in the middle of a listening tour to hear about future research projects, to learn about how we can engage with diverse audiences from all across every aspect of the food system value chain. So we're in the middle of talking to anyone and everyone that we can that plays some sort of role in the food system. So more specifically, the goals of this listening tour are to introduce the Food Systems Research Center to the region, and then through the listening tour, hear all about different from different food system stakeholders about your concerns and challenges, and to identify what research questions are out there that could be addressed in partnership, not only with the UVM Food Systems Research Center, but with partners in the community and with organizations all around the region and various state agencies and so on. So basically trying to get to a point of how we're going to work together to advance interesting, creative ways to building a resilient, equitable, and sustainable food system future. So I just wanted to reinforce that while the UVM Food Systems Research Center is fairly new, it recognizes that in operating with many well-established nonprofit systems and other groups and agencies like Food Solutions New England, that are already engaging in a lot of great work within the food system. This work is not meant to just be Vermont specific, which is why we're using platforms like this to engage with groups and individuals all around New England. So what's unique is other research centers across the US see the potential for this research and for engaging with folks in New England. And the work that everyone's doing. So it's really exciting, and we hope to hear about different pilot projects and research that are happening here in New England that can be used in other parts of the country as well. So it's a regional focus as a center, and certainly we feel that the impact could be much broader than that. So this is all to say we're partnering with Food Solutions New England for a listening session that'll be held on February 23rd, so just a couple weeks, and that'll be held from 11 to 12 p.m. We will be working through Food Solutions New England to promote that and to do some outreach and engagement. So they'll hopefully be in contact within the next few days for registration and things like that, but consider this a bit of a save the date. And you can see my information there on the screen, andrew.may@uvm.edu. Please reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, we hope that you'll join us in 2 weeks on the 23rd to share some of your insights and continue this conversation that we've had today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. We will be sure to share this information as we communicate with all registrants early next week. We'll share the webinar recording, recommended resources and readings link, the slide deck, and links to upcoming FSNE events that may be of interest, including those mentioned on the screen. The FSNE Winter Series begins next week, and the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge takes place in April. On behalf of FSNE and NESN, now that we are at time, I want to be sure to thank Julie Davidson and all of our panelists for this engaging panel, and thank you all for joining us today. At FSNE, we'll continue to build on our commitment to move forth with responsible action, to support communities, to generate alternative solutions, to challenge stereotypes, systemic oppression and prejudice, and to engage compassionate actions that create a more socially just, equitable, and peaceful world. So I will stop there. I know many will have to hop off, and then pass it back to Julie Davidson if you want to take a moment for any final comments.
No, I think you've covered it, Karen. We'll be planning a follow-up, make sure we get all the questions answered, and this is just the beginning of what we hope will be many conversations. So thank you to the panelists and everyone joining us here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Great.
Yep.
We will certainly circle back to respond to comments and questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see everybody's faces. I hope
Yeah.
you enjoy.
Thank you for sharing your voice.
Yeah, good to see you, and good to see everybody else too. Thank you guys for your presentations.
All right, signing off.
All right. Take care,
Thank
Abby.
you, Abby.
So
I'm going to remove the rest of these attendees. So you all
are
can
we talking
debrief.
at all or no?
I think if you want to share any suggestions for follow-up, this would be like off, immediately. I think that Julie and I would like to plan like how we can maybe hold not a webinar, but a subsequent follow-up conversation, open a Zoom room for people who might be interested in engaging in that Q&A session.
Yeah.
And obviously bringing people all together is challenging, but if you are available, Jennifer, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be important to have